was that since thank you. So the idea was that given that domain-wise and topic-wise, several data spaces are looking at similar use cases, it would make sense for us to come together and share our learnings with the stakeholders together so that no one has to go to several different places. So that said, we would like to welcome you to our joint webinar. A couple of housekeeping rules. The meeting is recorded, so if you have an issue with that, please turn off your camera or and remove your name. But if you are comfortable with that, we are always keen on knowing who is amongst the audience. So we are really happy if you include your name and organization. When you're not talking, please remain muted, and there will be allocated time for questions. So please feel free to put down your questions in the chat. We will react and take notice of that, and we will have also time to discuss those. I will be moderating today's webinar. My name is Sophie Mészáros, and I am part of the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities preparatory action, which we are coordinating on behalf of Open and Just Smart Cities and Communities, as it has been lately established. So let's just look at what we have today on the agenda. First, we're gonna have Leona King talk about the data space support center works, and then we are going to have the data space for tourism come on stage, which will be followed by the work of data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities. Then we will have the prep data space for mobility, explain their use cases, and finally we will have the Green Deal data space share their insights. Each presentation will be 15 minutes, and as said, you will have time to ask your questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Leona King. She's a researcher at CITIP, which is a research group at KU Leuven. Her research focuses on common European data spaces, in particular the legal frameworks and data governance mechanisms associated with such data infrastructures. So Leona, please come on stage. I will stop sharing so you can share your screen.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, we have quite a packed agenda, so I'll keep it brief, but thank you for the introduction. So as noted, I'm Leona King, and I'm a legal researcher at the Centre of IT and IP Law in KU Leuven. And today I'm speaking on behalf of the Data Space Support Centre. So I'd like to give you all a very warm welcome on behalf of the DSSC. And so today we're going to give you a brief kind of overview of data spaces and the governance frameworks that we're looking at and kind of exploring. So giving you an insight into the work that we're doing as part of the DSSC. So I think it's important just for the context as well. So to start, I think it's best to look at the European data strategy. So considering really the role that it has and what it means and how it's actually guiding us as well in our work in the DSSC. So the European data strategy, its real focus is trying to unleash the benefits of data sharing in Europe. And this is through a combination of fit for purpose legislation, as well as governance to ensure data availability. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the fact that we have these kind of new horizontal legal frameworks coming in and being introduced in, for example, the Data Governance Act will be enforced very soon. But we also have the Proposed Data Act, as well as the Implementing Act on High Value Data Sets. So we have this kind of growing legislative framework intended to support the governance of data and the data economy. And within that as well, we have common European data spaces. So common European data spaces, I thought they're best to kind of think of them in a functional way. So really what they're intended to do. So rather than getting too focused on some of the definitions, I think it's nice to think about them in a functional way. So what these kind of data infrastructures are really meant to do. And they're really meant to operationalize this European data strategy. So they're intended to implement the vision of the single market for data in Europe. And that includes this ensuring that data can flow within the EU and across sectors, as well as making sure that it adheres fully to EU values and rules. And for that, we really need to have clear and trustworthy data governance mechanisms in place. So within the DSSC, this is something that we're exploring. So really the governance dimension to complement this data sharing infrastructure. So more on what the actual DSSC is doing and our work. We've already released the starter kit and a glossary, which hopefully many of you are already familiar with. If so, then this graphic on the right-hand side, you'll be familiar with too. And also it's inspired by the work that's already been done by the OpenGI project. So we're really picking up on the building block model that they developed and trying to bring it further and advance it. And though we have this visual here on the right-hand side, we're really working to develop a new visual that really positions governance in a much more elevated level and also unpacks it. So we feel as though governance wasn't kind of paid the attention it deserves in the kind of previous work done to date. We feel as though there's still a lot of work to be done, and this is really the focus of our work now in the DSSC. So we're making sure that the business, governance and legal aspects are elevated and expanded. And we're doing that in cooperation with the rest of the community, and I'm very grateful to see so many familiar faces here today and some of the other panelists we've already had in our governance thematic group. So by interacting with the community through the various thematic groups that we've set up in the DSSC, as well as expert groups, we're really trying to incorporate the insights from the other projects and leverage the work that's being done on governance. I think today's webinar shows that there's a lot of interest in governance, so it's great for us to collaborate and leverage the work that we're doing. And this is really part of the DSSC in helping to coordinate this, so we're delighted to be involved today. That's not forgetting that the governance is also very much related to the technical side too. So we are really exploring kind of the latest insights that are coming from the technical convergence, kind of spearheaded by the Data Spaces Business Alliance as well. So on the kind of building blocks, we are going to hopefully have more information to share with you very soon. We're finalizing a document on our building block taxonomy, and then we have our 0.5 version of the blueprint that will be coming in September. And just to give you some more kind of information on what you can expect from this. So when I say that we're further developing the building block model, this is kind of currently the format that we're working with. So as you can see, we have really taken the kind of governance pillar and expanded it so that it actually incorporates elements such as business and legal. And we see that governance is very much interlinked with these other kind of aspects as well. So at the moment, you note that there's just kind of 3 building blocks there, but through the work that we're doing with the thematic group and expert groups and kind of a series of workshops, many of you may already have been involved. We're really trying to kind of unpack this and create kind of uniform components and units that will really help projects whenever they start designing data spaces. So we're unpacking this kind of business, legal and governance element and recognizing kind of the interrelations between these two. And despite the fact we see kind of a distinction made here between the green and the blue, we appreciate that the technical is very much relevant as well. It's to a certain extent, it really implements the kind of business, governance and legal building blocks as well. So hopefully very soon you'll see a more detailed version here where you actually have our building blocks named underneath business, governance and legal aspects as well. So going back to kind of more the focus of governance, what is governance in a data space? Well, for kind of a first place to start, we can look at the DSSC glossary. So there we've defined governance as the creation, development, maintenance and enforcement of a governance framework. But this then begs the question, what is a governance framework? For that, we also have a definition, and it refers to the set of principles, standards, kind of policies, which can refer to rules and regulations, as well as practices that define how a data space is governed and the decisions that are made. And it then introduces this role of the data space authority as well. So as I've already kind of identified today, governance is multifaceted, and it includes these kind of business, operational and legal aspects, as well as setting requirements for the kind of technical architecture of the data space too. But based on this, it still doesn't give us a very clear kind of understanding of exactly what governance is. It kind of alludes to some of the elements, but we think we kind of need a structure to further explore this. So this links to the work that we're doing in terms of the building blocks in trying to give more structure to governance. But before we do that, we almost have to take a step back to really kind of appreciate the full picture of governance. And so this is the output of one of the activities that we did in a workshop in the governance thematic group. So there we had various projects and initiatives represented, and we really did a brainstorm on what is governance and what can fall under this somewhat umbrella term. It's great to know that it's so broad and expansive, And we can see some really interesting kind of points raised from kind of more social and ethical considerations to different kind of relationships, such as private and public interactions. So we start to kind of identify some reoccurring elements that keep coming up, but governance is extremely expansive. So based on this, we've been trying to break this down and cluster it so that it's more structured, because working with governance as such a broad kind of term means that it's very difficult for us to actually functionally work with it. So one of the key things that we've been doing is identifying these kind of clusters almost. So we start with considering the roles and responsibilities. And you'll note in this kind of word cloud that certain roles continuously come up. And again, some of these are going to be coming from legislation as well. We can think of data altruism organizations, or data intermediaries. But then we also have the dimension on the kind of data layer in terms of the data governance framework. We identify this as another kind of key aspect. And then to frame more the kind of processes and decision making, we're also seeing this as a kind of a cornerstone that's coming out of the governance. So for the moment, we're kind of exploring these different clusters, but very much focusing on the content, because I think you'll see today as well, we can frame things with different titles, but really we need to take the opportunity to discuss with one another what these really mean. And I'm really excited that the different use cases will be extremely valuable for that too. So this is just an overview. You'll note that there's some other aspects that can come under the governance framework, but this just gives you kind of a sneak preview to some of the work that we're doing and the different framing that we can have for governance. But I'm very hopeful that the use cases today will give us greater insights. And for those of you that are interested, we often have presentations in our governance thematic group. So if you're working on governance and are interested in kind of sharing more about your work, please feel free to reach out. And I think I've just about kept within the time.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Leona. You were right on time. You have one question from Jose Maria Veganzones, more or less there with the name. The question is, the technical building blocks are available. Are they?
Yes, we have snippets on the platform. So if you bear with me, I'll pull them up and put it in the chat in the meantime.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for introducing the valuable work that the Data Space Support Center is doing. For those of you who are not familiar with the Data Space Support Center, which I'm sure you are with by now, they act as a central node for all the sectorial data spaces. So the work that they are doing is very valuable for all the sectorial data spaces. Those are the ones that are going to present right now. That said, we can move on to our second speaker, Eric Paul, who is here to represent DATES, the European Data Space for Tourism. Eric Paul is the chair of A New Governance, which is a non-profit based in Brussels. Their goal is to ensure more trusted and fair, to create more trusted and fair data infrastructures to ensure sovereignty over data, as opposed to other areas in the world. But they often work together with the European Commission and the Parliament, the OECD and the World Trade Organization or the World Economic Forum. Eric, please come on stage and share your screen with us.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Sophie. All right, you can see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for organizing this event. A New Governance is part of DATES. DATES is the CSA for tourism, and it's made up of companies from tourism, the tourism industry, and data, and that's very important to have both working together. When we start to talk about tourism, certainly you have those pictures in mind. But what's important is actually that well, when you look at those figures, like 27 million jobs, direct and indirect, or 10.3% of the EU GDP, it means that really it's a major EU industry, which, well, may be surprising for some, but when we say 10.3% of the EU GDP, in comparison, the automotive sector in Europe is 7% of the GDP. But there's actually another figure I want to point to you, and it's this one, the 745 million. This represents the international tourist arrivals in Europe, which is, well, 50% of the global market. And why I like this figure is that if we manage to have just 2 acts of data sharing per incoming visitor, we will have 1.5 billion sharings of data, which would already make some scale. Why tourism really needs a data space? Because it's a really specific sector. We have many interactions between, well, human talent, and human talent maybe, well, like here, the talent of the barman, but it can be also obviously museums, activities, etc., and obviously skills that are important to make this industry work, but also climate. So all the weather forecast, finances, transport, all the tourism destinations, and OASC or Eurocities obviously are important factors in there. But also another one, which is here at the right hand side of my screen, and that's the feelings of the tourist, the publications, the picture that it's taking, etc. This is obviously interesting, but it's interesting only if it's done in a fair and trustworthy way. We don't want our feelings to be shared with others, etc. Just maybe that it creates a profile. So really a very wide typology of actors and sources of information. So really clearly, tourism needs a data space. But the question here is, well, which governance framework do we need? So, well, you're all familiar with the notion of rule book. So we want to lay the foundations for a rule book for a tourism data space. And Leona, you spoke about the new EU data laws which are coming, and we come up with this pyramid with the EU level bodies, where the main question is, well, how do we ensure that data sharing governance delivers the expected results? And I remind you that one of the objectives of the data strategy is to create a level playing field, to ensure that it's not just a big platform that benefits, but also the small players that can be SMEs, startups, etc., really benefit from it. And in tourism, 75% of companies are SMEs and very small companies. At member state, well, it's how do we implement the data sharing governance on a national level, and maybe also how do we incentivize public and private sector to go into data sharing. And if we look at ourselves as data space initiatives, the main question is, well, how do we govern ourselves? And how do we govern ourselves? It's not just a matter of law, regulation, decisions, etc. It's also, well, what do we want to do as a data space? And in our case, it's clearly, how do we innovate? Well, we want to innovate and grow, and have this innovation and growth for all types and sizes of actors in a trustworthy framework. But to do this, obviously, we are quite helped, because we have all the elements that come from the EU level, from the member state level, and also technical level, which can come from, well, the standards of Gaia X, IDSA, or soon the edicts, and then the tourism data space rulebook. And what is nice is that obviously the first 3 levels are common to all data spaces, which is interoperability. But also one point is that we don't want to create a big monolith, and we are aware that there are more regional initiatives, more local initiatives, etc., that need to be aggregated to create really a federation of systems. So we have defined what we call sub-tourism data space, and those, when they write their rule books, will have to take into account the 4 rule books that are above. So when we look at, and it may shock a few of you, but when we talk about the rule book for the tourism sector, and I guess that it's the case in other industries, it is first and foremost about tourism, not about data sharing. What are the objectives of the industry? What do consumers and customers or companies want to achieve? And then data sharing is a tool that is going to build this. And in Europe we have, and in tourism we have the good fortune to have many actors involved in data sharing, and those are just a selection of European associations in charge of tourism. We have Nextur, which is one of the member of the consortium, but we have others which may be very interesting and who will probably come up with interesting use cases. For instance, we have here the European Network of Accessible Tourism. If you have accessibility problems in your life, well, the fact that you don't have to input the same information all the time may be obviously interesting. We have also the Youth Hostel Association, and I think it's important because clearly those guys are born digital, so it may be interesting. But you take any icon, any logo, you liaise it with another, and you have potentially a use case or several use cases. So if we push the logic further, tourism data space governance starts also with a tourism sector governance. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have already existing bodies in the tourism sector, existing guidelines and policies, existing standards, both in the tourism sector and in the data sharing sector. So what we need to do is to create our rule book, is really to identify the gap and try to close it. So another pyramid, I guess that because we're a CSA on tourism, we like pyramids. It makes us think of Egypt, but more seriously, on this pyramid, well, you see the three levels and also the sectoral approach. And our governance framework needs to take into account what we call the hard law, and this is what Leonard has spoken about, but also the soft law, which is more the bottom-up approach. And all those three sectors will enable us to write our rule book, which take all the elements from every level. If you need the presentation, I think will be available afterwards. So I won't go too much into detail because we favor questions and discussions. But so there's the first pillar, which is the rule book, but there is also what we call the role book. The role, who does what, who decides on what. And in our opinion, this is going to really strengthen the governance, both at data space level, but also at European level, so that there are no gaps, no overlaps, and that things are very clear, that when you want to create a data space, you can virtually press a button and you know exactly who does what and who has done what, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And here are obviously a few other things that our governance will need to do. We are working on this with Citra at the moment, and after the summer we will publish a document on the holistic European data governance at EU level, member state level, and data space level. But obviously for data space, the work we're going to we are doing with dates, it will be published beforehand. So in terms of tourism data space, there's one question that we ask ourselves is, and that we think we need to ask ourselves, is about the legal structure. Shall it have a legal structure or not? And then the three main items that need to be touched upon are well, obviously organizational agreements, operational agreements, how does it work? And business agreements, how do we automate links so that it's not, oh, we need to create an API, etc. No, it's data sharing. So it needs to be almost at the touch of the button that you can do something. So the way we see it is that our governance should be made up of, well, some of the European tourism associations that you saw on the previous slide, but also representatives of the data spaces which are upcoming, and it should have also a coordinator. This coordinator would work with the EDIB, but also with the data space support organization. So currently the DSSC, but we don't know how at the end of the 36-month project of the DSSC, we don't know how it will be called. So this is why we've been a bit larger. And then we will create this holistic and adaptive tourism data space rulebook. Adaptative in our opinion is very important, because yes, technology is important, but it's a tool, and also technology will evolve, even though the industry will create new services, but with several technologies. Another point that is important for our coordinator for this rulebook, is that it will feed into the tourism ecosystem, who will be able to innovate, to create new services using this rulebook, which will be empowered or boosted by the rulebook. And eventually, this will have an impact on the leisure and business travelers that we are all. But obviously, especially in tourism, there are interfaces with a lot of other data spaces: mobility, skills and jobs, finance, health, Green Deal, and many others, energy, etc. So we need to have also, this is why we think we need this coordinating role. How it's going to be done, well, it will have to be decided. After all, we're just a CSA laying the ground, but there's a huge need for coordination. In terms of practical dimensions, well, you won't be surprised by what's in the middle, because that's what we have been discussing with the Data Space Support Center, etc., and the ecosystem. I would like now just to touch on 2 points, which are the dark blue. The purpose, we need to define for the tourism data space what the purpose is, so that we have like the spirit of the law, you could say. Those are our objectives, so that when when new players enter, etc., we can still refer to it to make sure that we are on the right path. But at the same time, it needs to be adaptive. So at the end of the day, we need to audit what we are doing, clearly, but also adapt our governance to changing situations, technologies, and maybe obviously regulations. Well, in a nutshell, this is what we are about. You will have on the slide the website of the CSA, as well as the contact details of both project coordinator, work package lead, and of myself. Voila. So,
thank you, Eric, very much for the presentation about the governance work being done in the context of the data space for tourism. And thank you for just reinforcing the thought that we are not here to reinvent the wheel, but in all these data spaces, we are working towards also understanding the ecosystem and understanding the good practices that are already out there, and to build on existing knowledge. So I assume that everyone who is here in this webinar is also here to do the same. So we are very appreciative of that. And we are here to also share this knowledge with you. So if you have any other questions following the webinar, please do reach out to us. That said, let's move on to our next speaker, Justine Gagnon, who is from Eurocities. Justine is also a dear colleague of mine. We work together on the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities preparatory action. She's leading the work on governance. She actually moved to Brussels and joined Eurocities recently, and she's working on projects related to digital transformation, digital literacy, and smart cities. Please, Justine, come online and share your screen.
No problem. Thank you, Sophie. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. But we can't see the
Yeah.
screen.
I'm showing it right now. No worries. And sorry. Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for attending the webinar. I'm really happy to contribute to this webinar and share the thoughts we had on the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities. So DS for SSCC. You can see on the slide all the partner organizations that are involved in the project. As Sophie has said, working with your cities, and I'm involved more specifically on Work Package 2, which is really looking at the possible ways of governing the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities. So I really enjoy Eric's presentation. I think there are many overlaps. I will take a more bottom-up approach, but I think we will find similar questions and similar findings emerging. Just to put the DS4SSCC in context, so it's not only the governance work that we're doing, so developing a governance schema, but also there's a technical work package led by the Fire Foundation. We have already published a catalog of specification, and soon we will publish a reference architecture and cookbook. And there's also a work that is being done on identifying priority data sets and creating a roadmap to implement the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities. So very much embedded within a broader context, and all of it, the first blueprint will be published in September, as I believe a lot of us have to do. So in terms of the governance, we started around bringing together relevant stakeholders and looking a bit on the demand side, so cities and communities, and supply side. So we have other stakeholders, including academia, the private sector, wide range of private sector actors, as well as civil society organization, NGOs, etc. And we decided to focus the work from first the point of view of cities, because they're already grounded in a local context and local ecosystem, and see how they interact with these other type of stakeholders. So for example, private sector with B2G data sharing, collaboration with academia, collaboration with citizen science, etc. So everything that involves multi-stakeholder kind of data exchange, and trying really to capture all these ecosystem worked and what we could draw as lessons for the governance scheme of the data space for smart communities, because these data spaces are really grounded in local context and need to benefit cities and communities. And then we really need to scale them up and connect them together with other data spaces, as well as with other ecosystem in local context. So it's quite a big complex picture that is emerging. And we decided to focus on use cases, mapping exactly who were the stakeholders that were involved in each of the use cases using this quadruple helix. So as I say, academia, private sector, public sector, and civil society. But also mapping quite precisely the different data sets that were exchanged and shared, and the data flow, from which direction they were going, etc. What were the enablers? What were the challenges? And interestingly, and I think that was really part of the governance aspect, is also mapping the different types of exchanges between stakeholders, because we often focus on the data, but actually other aspects are really, really important, like knowledge exchange, legal support, data skills, different type of data service provider, data intermediaries, citizen involvement. And all of this is really governance. So obviously it's very connected to the flow of data itself, but it's also important to have this other layer that is more organizational and systemic in mind. So we've done some mapping, and we collaborated with different cities on what they were doing already in sharing data with different type of stakeholder, and we created a work program. So here is quite quickly the timeline we had. We focused on two type of use cases. One that was more related to mobility and how to manage traffic management to reduce air pollution and congestion in cities. And the second one was around energy and how to anticipate the potential of a solar panel on public rooftop in deprived area, and how that could help citizens decrease their energy bill. And as you can see here, in terms of participants, we have quite a large numbers of cities as listed here at the bottom. And then we have a broader forum with all stakeholders, including the supply, demand, so academia, private sector, and civil society organization. What was interesting, and I will speak to this data canvas a bit later on when I will present the data use cases. But here is like throughout the work we've done with cities, especially Amsterdam City Council, but they all thought it would be nice to have a tool to kind of encompass those governance aspects. And you will find different aspect that has been raised by Eric already. But here they kind of divided the compass into three broad scope, or three broad like columns. So the first one is why, and it's really about the scope, the context, and what exactly are the benefits of the data cooperation. So this, you can see, is the one in the middle. Then on the left-hand side is really focusing around the question of governance. They call it organizational. It's a co-development exercise. So the language might change slightly, but the conversations are quite in line with what we've just seen. So really organizational aspect of governance, the business case, the incentives, the mapping of the stakeholders, the rules, and what is shared, what is not shared, and how it is implemented. And then on the right-hand side is more the technical aspect that is being developed in collaboration with package 3 at the moment. So it's still very much a work in progress, as you can see, and I'm happy to share the slides afterwards. But I thought it would be really interesting to just explore this using a specific example and a use case. I have two, but I might not have time for two. But anyway, I will start with Amsterdam and the use cases that really was at the start of developing this data cooperation canvas. So it was, it still is, the Amsterdam Intelligence Data Exchange Alliance. So basically it's an alliance between Amsterdam City, The Hague City, but also a region, so the North Province of the Netherlands, as well as the national transport authorities. And they have come together to basically create a data exchange to improve data on roadworks. So the context is that basically Amsterdam has data on the planned roadwork. So they have a time period when they know that there will be roadwork on a specific street, but they don't know exactly when this roadworks will take place, because often it's outsourced by a third party that is actually conducting the roadworks. So it was interesting was, well, we could use this data that we have, so it's public sector data around planned roadworks, and really add to it, or like aggregate it, combine it with a floating car data, which is private sector data, to really cross check what was actually happening on the road. So that was really this willingness to create this partnership. So as you can see here, I'm going to explain this. So on the left-hand side, you really have the 4 first partners. So the City of The Hague, City of Amsterdam. In the middle is the National Transport Agency. I'm not going to try to say it because I don't speak Dutch. And then the province of North Holland. And they first send all the data to the National Data Access Point. And the National Data Access Point made it open access to other private sector actors. But basically they realized that none of these private sector's actors were using the data because it wasn't of good quality enough and reliable enough for them to use it. So they decided to stop doing that, and they collaborated with a startup that really helped them to improve the data quality of the public sector data, and then using also private sector data to aggregate it together to create value, and then send it back into the loop. And what was interesting is that the private sector companies can also give feedback to the startups that is improving the data quality over time, and also directly to the cities and national bodies. And also interestingly, and for sustainability of this project, the startup that is at the moment helping with the data quality, developing algorithm to aggregate the private sector data with the public sector data, is going to transfer all this technology to the NDW, which is a National Data Access Point. And that's a public sector body. So this will become part of the National Data Access Point and therefore sustainable. So you can see here, and I'm not going to get into detail, but basically what we've done is using the data cooperation canvas to really map these use cases in terms of governance model, in terms of what are the shared processes, what were the stakeholders, the incentive, the context. So really doing a lot of work on the mapping, which I will take to draw and expand it to the governance of the data space for smart and sustainable cities and communities. I'm just going to skip that one. But also what's important is the benefits of this data collaboration between the private and public sector. So obviously there's better quality of traffic data for all sides. So from the local authorities that they know globally when the roads are shut for roadworks, and they can also check on subcontractors, basically, which they couldn't before. But also is better data for navigation service providers, such as Waze or Google Map or etc. To help their user to know in advance that there will be roadworks on a specific street. And obviously it reduces also traffic disruption and air pollution, and accelerate the shift to a smart and sustainable mobility. I will quickly run through the second example because I think I'm running out of time, but basically it's a similar process we've done using the use cases in Barcelona around energy communities. And here you can see at the bottom the different partners that were involved. So a startup is called Impacti, the data science department at the University of Barcelona, Acciona, which is an energy supplier and quite a big, large corporation, and Barcelona City Council. So they developed together a tool to assess the maximum surplus of solar energy from municipal buildings and public spaces in relation to the spending of the household in a situation of energy poverty. They use a mix of public and private sector data, as you can see in the table here on the bottom. And basically the purpose of this is to help families that are in situation of energy poverty by redirecting some of this energy created by solar panel on the public building roof and decreasing their bills. Again, we've done a similar mapping, and I think that's very important that this is the same structure so we can see the commonalities and the differences and really start like drawing those lessons and what we can take a level further for the governance of the data space for smart and sustainable communities. So here again, I will share the slides. You can have a look at the details of the two use cases. And here is the rendering of the tools that Barcelona is now using. So here, as you can see, is the maximum potential. And here is actually, they have identified the cases where it's really beneficial for the communities in these three neighborhoods to have solar panel in the vicinity. So I think I've said here the benefits. So obviously helping decision-making in terms of energy transition, also the transition to clean, affordable and secure energy, and the reduction of energy poverty. And I want us to finish on the lesson for the data space for smart and sustainable cities and community governance, but I guess more generally for the lessons around governance of data spaces. So what I'm hearing often, and it can be B2G, so business to government data sharing, but also when academia is involved or where citizen science is involved, is really identifying win-win situations. Legislation is a possible stick, it's possible and useful in some cases, and putting data sharing obligation clauses in public procurement, for example, is a solution that is really helping. However, it's always better to find mutual incentives to collaborate. So it's really about identifying what is in it for each of the stakeholders. What's also very important is to start from use cases and existing needs. So we have lots of, and it was the same with Smart Cities project, lot of diagram and ambitions, but really what we need is like, what do we need on the ground and what will be the actual benefits of this data sharing, starting from there, building the trust and then scaling up. What I hear also a lot is really the importance of defining role and responsibilities. So I'm really happy that the DSSC, the Data Spaces Support Center, is looking at that, and as well as Eric that has just put forward some of it. Really, we need to know what are the different roles in these data spaces, but also what are the different rules for the stakeholders. So for example, if you're a private sector corporation, you might not have exactly the same rule if you're a public body as if you're in academia, etc., etc. So it's really important to make that clear from the outset. Finally, the importance of intermediary organization, especially when it comes to business to governance data sharing. So this could be academia, it could also be a non-for-profit organization, or just data intermediaries are a very good way of ensuring or like fostering trust between stakeholders that don't necessarily trust each other, or when there is a competition, there are competitors. For example, e-soft mobility providers that are catering for the same city, they might not want to share the data with the city, but if there is a third party or an intermediary organization, this can really help with the ensuring trust in this ecosystem. And the role of knowledge and best practice sharing, as we're doing here as part of the CSS community, but I think it also applies as part of the data space community. So there is really a role for a community orchestrator. There might be a space also for a repository of good practices. So really people don't start from scratch, and there is a way of replicating things that have been done and proven to work in specific context. So that's all for me. This is my contact. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or just to ask at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justine, for this very interesting use cases, both of them. You received some questions in the chat, but before we go there, I just want to announce to everyone that all presentations will be shared with the participants. Today, when you registered, we got your email address, so we will circulate all the content. Okay, so some of the questions are, and also there will be a link to recording. Yes, everything will be made available. So let's go from the first question. Curious to know the main tech suppliers and how these tech providers view data spaces, the idea of data spaces. Is there any pushback, legal issues on the horizon already? From Tjerk Timan.
Yeah, okay. That's a very interesting question. And I think that's why we have the stakeholder forum in the project, is really to bring also the supply side. And overall, I don't think there's a pushback. I think actually the people on the supply side, they really want to answer and make sure that the solutions they develop actually answer the needs of the cities. And usually there is a need to share data really to further the public good, but also there's a good business model for it, for the business perspective and the technology companies. So I think that it's not like antagonistic, and it's really, as I was saying, identifying win-win situation. In terms of the legislation, again, some of the legislation can be useful, but I would put the emphasis more on collaboration and what we can do without necessarily like bringing the stick first.
Thank you. Then we had some questions about the generality of the governance model. Is it use case specific, or can it be, so do you have to do it for every use case, or can it be for all use cases? Martin Reichert.
That's what is very interesting with the data cooperation canvas, which we will adapt to be a structure for the governance of the data space. It is eventually use case specific, just because these ecosystems are grounded in local context. So as also Eric was saying, it's about the scope, and often the scope is connected to the national legislation, to the relations that are already existing in local context, to whether or not the energy company, for example, is a public utility or a private utility. So it's really related to context. But at the same time, because it's structured in a similar way, you can really learn the different elements from different use cases that would work for your own situation. And I think in that way, it's quite useful.
The next question is again from Tjerk Timan. What is the business model for data intermediaries?
That's a good question. I think I can't necessarily reply to all of it. What I said from the city's point of view. So cities, sometimes they don't have necessarily the capacity. We know that they have a funding issue. They don't necessarily have the skills. So they're quite happy if they trust the data intermediary to have a model, for example, of software as a service, or like just whatever as a service, infrastructure as a service, etc. If they know that it's trustworthy, it's interoperable, and it's auditable. So I think they're quite happy to have that to help them make the most of the data they have, or make the most of business to govern data sharing. I'm sure there will be other business models, but that's the one I see from kind of the city's perspective.
There were some questions regarding the use cases. How do you get involved in the use cases? How do you propose a new use case? And we also got a specific question about the use case in Zaragoza, which you could maybe later answer to Daniel Jimenez.
Yeah. So Zaragoza is part of the group we're discussing with, and they have lots of interesting use cases. At some point, we needed to make a decision on which one to put forward. But I'm always interested in hearing about use cases, and I know that Zaragoza is doing a lot of work on logistics and etc. And when it comes, what was the first question? Yeah, getting involved, bringing use cases forward. I think actually Sophie would be the contact point, because the following up of the data space for smart communities preparatory action, which will end on the 1st of October, when we will publish the blueprint, is the deployment call, and there will be a call for projects, etc. So basically, my advice is stay tuned, attend the stakeholder forum, and be in touch with Sophie. She will know what's coming up.
Thank you, Justine, and thank you for the presentation. There are some more questions for you in the chat, but I suggest that we move on so that we will have time for the next two data spaces as well. So next up, we have Charlotte Toussaint. I hope maybe you can repeat your last name.
Charlotte Ducran. I'm very much used to people not being able to pronounce my name, so you just call me Charlotte. That's really fine. No worries.
Okay. Sorry about that. So Charlotte is here joining us on behalf of PrEP Data Space for Mobility. She's a doctoral researcher in law at CITIP, KU Leuven. So she's actually a colleague of Leona. And she's questioning whether EU data legislation can establish data markets while at the same time keeping the balance with European values. So please, Charlotte, take the stage and explain us about the PrEP Data Space for Mobility.
You should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, not on full screen though yet.
Is it fine now?
Perfect, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me here. I take the opportunity to say that I really liked the previous presentation, so it was very interesting for me to hear. My perspective, though, is a little bit different. I really take a regulatory perspective. So my question is, if we take the mobility sector in particular, what are the specificities from a regulatory perspective? And I want to look at it kind of both ways. So on the one hand, the question is, how is mobility specific concerning data and data regulation compared to other sectors and potential data spaces? On the other way around, I think it's interesting to look at mobility from the perspective of how mobility as a sector and mobility datafication as a history, what can it teach maybe to other data spaces or other data sharing and data processing situations. So I will just try to throw a few pointers there. So yeah, my first point is the specificities of mobility concerning data and data regulation. So those specificities, they stem from the specificities of mobility as a sector. So first, is mobility really specific as a sector? The thing is, mobility is not a sector. We know that with data spaces, it's not easy to draw boundaries of what's in, what's out. It's particularly the case with mobility. Mobility actually is comprised of different transport modes. This is something everybody will know, but of course they are subject to various governance models that are very much influenced by the law, especially in the EU, because of the EU project that kind of comes on top of the national layers. We have a very important imbrication of public and private actors and sectors, but also this imbrication is differentiated. It's not the same in all the sectors. One of the very important elements is the liberalization process that has been really driven by the EU. So I'm a railway person deep in my heart. So if you look at aviation and the railways, aviation is a little bit international driven, so it's a little bit different. But if you look at those two, obviously liberalization has come up with a lot of legislations that are very much based on EU law. So of course they're implemented in national legislation, so there is some form of harmonization. But it's also very much mode specific, but also local specific. So it means national legislation can actually diverge. You can also have this multi-level governance difference that we see in a lot of such modes. An important element here is, so within, especially within the liberalization context, still you do have public service obligations. So we had them before the liberalization process. We still have them now that such sectors are liberalized, but they have a different form. So let's say they constitute a form of lex specialis compared to markets and market regulation. Also very important, we have a distinction between long distance and urban transports that are within several transport modes. So this is the divergent side. So the idea that mobility is actually not a one single thing. This being, we have also elements of convergence. And here I think what is important to bear in mind is that mobility, as put in mobility data space, is actually the one project that datafication and digitalization are expected to deliver on. I think it's very important to understand. I really liked what Eric earlier said, that what is important is not data sharing, is tourism. In this case, it's mobility. What data sharing is expected to deliver is obviously local. It depends. So here, the project is really to build mobility. So I refer on my slide to the ITS directive, which I think is also related to what Justine said earlier. She didn't refer to it, but I kind of guess that it plays a role in the use case that she referred to. So the ITS directive is a directive that dates back from 2010, but it says essentially that the European Commission should have powers to lay down data sharing obligations for a number of mobility-related use cases. It really starts from road transport as a key entry point, but the idea is that we bring together different transport modes via the data layer, so to speak. Now there is a revision underway, but the idea is really to ease smart mobility and so on and so forth. So another element that I think is really bringing the different transport modes together is the importance of the infrastructure. So historically, we have the physical infrastructure, that's clear, and now we have to take into account the digital infrastructure that comes on top as well. That comes with a number of implications. So first, well, I'm not looking into economics right now, but obviously infrastructure means very often public funding, which is an element that is very often present in mobility. This also means that transport is local, so transport data are also local. And finally, but only a pointer again, infrastructure, although it does not necessarily mean networks, in the case of mobility, infrastructure and networks are very closely connected. So it means we have network effects at the level of physical infrastructure and potentially at the level of the digital infrastructure as well. Another element that you could consider as an element of convergence between the different transport modes and anything that you refer to with mobility is the fact that some actors are actually in between public and private logics. So here I have to refer to my own experience as an in-house lawyer in the railways before. So I was working for the Belgium railway infrastructure manager, and there the liberalization process was so that, so in Belgium, this is Infrabel, so a public undertaking, meaning that you have a semi-private, semi-public legal regime, together with public funding, together with a lot of obligations, together with legal monopoly for certain activities, together with a legal obligation to try and make money. So this is a bundle of things that you have to find your way in. And then comes the data layer that actually reinforces this, let's say, uncomfortable position between the public and the private logic. So I recently conducted a study for RNE, so RailNet Europe, that is the gathering of national railway infrastructure managers in order to facilitate international railway traffic. And they were really inquiring about how do we go about the data that we do have in store. What can we do with such data? Can we monetize them? Can we not? And so on and so forth. So I conducted this study as part of CITIP, so my research center, together with my colleagues Orient 2 and Aliki Benmayer. So I'd like to also thank them for their work. But really one of the things was that it's not an easy thing for someone like RNE or others who do have very interesting data, but they have very contradictory obligations. So on the legal context, it's not an easy thing to do, to have on the one hand an incentive or even an obligation to share data, to make them available for further reuse, and on the other hand, to have confidentiality obligations because you are in a business context. So you have confidentiality obligations vis-a-vis your customers, but on the other way around, you have obligations to make data available for further reuse. Another element here is that I think the liberalization process plays a very significant role in the data environment. So this is an element that was demonstrated by Montero and Finger. They show that liberalization leads to fragmentation of actors and activities, especially in the network context, and it creates interfaces, and therefore interfaces, because of communication between different actors, creates data. I think that's an interesting element, that we have a lot of operational data in the context of liberalized industry. So finally, very obviously, transport is often safety critical, which plays a role on data sharing, data quality expectations, and so on. So that was the first thing that I wanted to do. So I wanted to just give a few pointers to the specificities of mobility vis-a-vis other contexts, other sectors. The second thing is now looking kind of the other way around, what mobility and mobility datafication can teach to the overall process, but also potentially to other data spaces and contexts. I wanted to make a point, as you will see, again, you can feel the railway taste very much. So the transport sector, mobility, if you will, is very much characterized by interoperability. And again, it's particularly a result of liberalization, but also the need for safety. So in liberalization, as I said, created fragmentation of economic operations. So you actually need tools and processes to make those different entities work together. And interoperability, broadly said, is about this. It used to be that, especially in aviation and the railways, it used to be that you had one incumbent operator. So you don't need interoperability if you have one incumbent operator, one integrated incumbent one. You need interoperability if you have different actors. So then, as a matter of law, I think something that is quite interesting in how interoperability has been imposed by law is that it's at least in the railways, it's been designed as a community building exercise. So maybe some of you have heard of TAP and TAF TSIs, so technical specifications for interoperability concerning the passenger and respectively the freight telematic applications. So here the idea of the law, so based on EU railway law, was to design a community of stakeholders, so both railway stakeholders and semi-railway stakeholders, if you will, such as ticket vendors. The idea is to mandatorily bring them together so that they have to come up with the standards. And then in an iterative manner, the legislator then brings those standards in law by changing the law. So this is very much of an iterative process that has been on for many years now. What does it teach us, in my view? First, that the co-regulatory approach, especially to standard making and interoperability, is very far from new. Railways is only one off. Secondly, this is a long-term endeavor. This does not come at the touch of a click. And thirdly, there is very much of an insider-outsider phenomenon, which is that, of course, those which are within the community, they can take part in standard making, while those who are not can't. So it's more costly for them to adapt. What we can see here, more specifically to the transport area, is that well, this whole interoperability endeavor has been very much model specific. So now the problem, especially with data exchange, is that it might be a break to intermodal interoperability. So TAF and TAP TSIs are a typical example of really like data sharing relevant standard making processes, but are very much railway specific. So now other iterations are expected to ease that, but that's something that I think we should keep in mind when designing data-related interoperability measures. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to say, so I'll be actually quite quick if I have a good count of time, is the relationship between infrastructure and platforms and the role of datafication therein. So again, I'm referring to the work of Montero and Finger. What they showed, not only in the transport sectors, but also more generally in network industries, is that when there is external datafication, namely datafication from actors who are not from that sector, there is a risk of what they call platformization. So legacy players might be platformed by external players who are active only in the data layer, because the data layer can be used to actually restructure and re-intermediate the sector. And I think an important point which has to be borne in mind based on the previous slides that I presented is that it's not only a market problem, it's not only a matter of internalizing the value of data, it's also because you have infrastructure, so you have public funding issues. So you might have a public value that is going outside of the sector through this platformization phenomenon. And this risk might be reinforced by what I call the data as infrastructure motto. So this idea that because data is an infrastructure, there should be obligations to share them because it's good, because it can be reused at no cost, if you apply this to mobility, especially in case of infrastructure and public funding, then you reinforce this very risk. I would say I view this as an illustration of a more general argument. The data is always local, which I think has been kind of said a few times here already in various shapes. So what do we do about this? In my view, it challenges the sole regulatory focus on data, with the implicit idea that data is a resource that could be dealt with as such. So what does it mean exactly then positively in terms of positive solutions? Maybe in some cases, we need to have integrated regulation of value chains. Maybe that's something that's been discussed in the context of smart mobility players. Also, I just wanted to point to, I think, an interesting research that is going on both actually on both sides of the Atlantic, so both in the US and here in Europe, that that's why I actually call it from infrastructure to platform and back, that there is also the discussion that maybe online platforms, or some of them, are also infrastructural in a way. So it means that they deliver on services or services that are of general interest for society, meaning in a defensive manner that society necessarily relies on some of them. If you go down that path, that means that you may want to regulate them in a way that is kind of analogized to this of network industries and infrastructure as we know them, notably in the transport sectors. So these are the few pointers that I wanted to make on a very general perspective, I would say. And I thank you for your attention. These are a few references. So on the one hand, references of my own work, either alone or jointly with colleagues, and then of other sources that are referred to in this presentation.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for providing us with so many references that we can review that refer to existing legal work pertaining to governance. Also, some of the participants added some links in the chat. You can maybe review them. And we can then move on to our next speaker. So Sergio Cinirella, who is here represent on behalf of the CNR Institute, which is a multidisciplinary research institute. He's there and looking at the atmospheric pollution research. But today he's here because he's providing us with a use case in the context of the GREAT data space, which is the data space focusing on Green Deal. So it's similarly to the DSSC, it's a cross-disciplinary data space. Sergio, please come online and share your screen. Thank you.
You can see my screen? Yeah, thank you, Sophie, thank you. All right, I'm Sergio Cinirella, a senior researcher at the Institute of Atmospheric Pollution, since a long time involved in the building of this global observation system for Mercury, the GOOS4M. I will tell you more later. So, which is the context? The GOOS4M was selected as a use case in a GREAT project. The GREAT project is aimed to establish the Green Deal Data Space Foundation and its community of practice, which is, of course, which will be built on the European Green Deal and the EU data strategy for data. So to build this community, GOOS4M was selected as a use case, among others. GOOS4M was one of them and is the most mature use case. Please let me introduce the group on Earth observation to which the GOOS4M participate, because GOOS4M is a flagship of this group. What is the group, the GEO, Group on Earth Observation? GEO is an intergovernmental organization with more than 1,000 members and in more than 1,000 participating organizations. A lot of Earth observation data, a lot of data providers, a number of work program activities. It is, of course, committed, not really, of course, but it is committed to improve the availability and access use of Earth observation in for the benefit of the society. The GEO program is organized in activities. So to implement the work program, a number of flagship have been selected as of their maturity. There are a number of initiatives, geopilot initiatives. The maturity grow from initiative, pilot initiative to flagship. On top of this, there are regional geos that are aimed to push the activity at caucus level. So the flagship actually are 5. GOOS4M is one of them, and is aimed to build the global observation system for Mercury. But which is the context of the GOOS4M? The context of the GOOS4M is a political context, because, as you know, there are a number of international conventions to which countries are participating. The one on Mercury, the Minamata Convention of Mercury, is one of them. And the GOOS4M is aimed to support the implementation of this convention. So it is aimed to provide a data set, of course, on Mercury in the atmosphere. Data should be comparable, should be harmonized, and all regional existing network at regional level should be interlinked. The GOOS4M should provide, but now it is providing a knowledge hub that integrates Earth observation data, modeling tools, and this is for co-design and assess the implementation of the convention. So the effectiveness evaluation of the convention, that means how policy are acting at environmental level, can be evaluated through a knowledge hub. Which are the key aspects of the GOOS4M? The key aspect of the knowledge hub that we are building is that this is an integrated multimodal and multi-domain computational platform. It is based on an emulator. I will explain more later on this, but this emulator can provide scientific-based information for policymakers. This is very important, a very important topic. Of course, we share data, we share programming components, and the end user, the decision maker, the policymaker can act as its own to assess and to analyze the possible scenario. So the knowledge hub has a data value chain because is built on top of data production. So we collect observation, we run chemical mathematical models, and we provide output of models, which are models that are very, very complex and cannot be run on the web. We provide QA, QC for our information. All information is cataloged and published through a platform. So at the end, from a scientific data, we provide knowledge to policymakers. So the process, the workflow, brings data, scientific data from the collectors to the end users. It is not simple as a process because several things should be done before. So in few words, very simple, because I do not enter in details. We archive data that are QA/QC, and they pertain to monitoring station, as you can see in this slide. We have done a lot of monitoring campaign along marine cruises, along aircraft cruises in the world. So all data are available, but these data are not useful for policymaker because you can, of course, understand how is going trend of mercury in the atmosphere in somewhere, but this data is not useful for assessing the implementation of the convention. To do this, you have to run models that ingest a lot of information ranging from satellite information to campaign, etc. So the data we collect are ingested by the model for calibration, for validation, etc. At the end, we produce scenario. So one scenario is, for example, how much is the reduction of mercury in one region, for example, Southeast Asia, if we reduce mercury emission in North America. So this is an example of one scenario. Of course, everything because of the chemical behavior of mercury. The key point for the analysis is the biota, because at the end, mercury is harmful to humans only by ingesting seafood, fish. The concentration of mercury in biota is a key point for our evaluation. The Knowledge Hub has actually a number of components. Each one is aimed to give information on something. So a user can, for example, browse emission data by countries and by industrial sector, can browse and download a data set, and then can do a self-assessment for the region of interest. So by moving slides, he can try to understand how mercury abatement can impact another region. Changes in deposition and partners are provided. Of course, mercury impacts not only lands, but also and mainly oceans, giving a trend of concentration in oceans. We have, because of a scenario are provided only for atmosphere, we linked a biogeochemical model to the mercury model output. So at the end, a user can have a flavor, let's say, can have a flavor on how mercury concentration impact an abatement, can impact marine biota. This is not the end of the Knowledge Hub, because it is very important to provide the cost of abatement of a technology, because to achieve a given abatement, a given reduction to the risk, there is a need to evaluate the cost of such measure. a component of the knowledge hub is providing the cost of abatement. The knowledge hub, the GOOS4M, sorry, is not only an infrastructure, is really a link between partners. So actually, we established governing bodies. We are 21 partners. We have one co-chair, 3 co-chairs, a focal point for each region, and everyone that is interested to participate to GOOS4M can submit a membership agreement in which data policy, data participation to the governing body is described. We are developing the last component of the knowledge hub, that is the human health risk module, which will evaluate the exposure to mercury in the food chain, and at the end of the fish we eat every day or somewhere, or once a day, once per week in some other region.
Sergio, just a heads up that we have 2 minutes left of the webinar.
Yeah, I finished. The GOOS4M has a sustainability perspective because we are participating to the IRIN research infrastructure, that is an ESFRI infrastructure. But I want to point out that environmental data in the near future will be linked, will interact with health data. So there are a number of issues that should be considered, ethical, legal, and social issue, data governance in terms of licensing and sustainability, but mainly among others, the science policy interaction, because data before publishing should be formally approved. So thank you, and sorry to have taken much time.
Oh, we were on time. Thank you so much. Just together with the questions, we were struggling to keep up with the time limits. But thank you very much for all the speakers of today. I think this was a very holistic review of all the governance work being done in different sectors and across the sectors. For questions, please do reach out to us. I understand there was maybe not sufficient time allocated for Q&A, but we are here to answer questions. So feel free to reach out. We will put you in touch with the relevant experts. I would like to thank everyone for their participation. A special thanks for Enol, from colleagues from Enol, Giacomo Lozzi and Michelle Gonzalez Torres for putting this together and for your wonderful organizational skills, and for hosting this. I wish everyone a wonderful day. And for any questions, as said, please get in touch. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.